A woman vanished into the Texas death row system for the horrific torture and starvation of a 9-year-old boy, leaving a community shattered and questioning how such evil could exist. But 10 years later, as she faced her final moments in the execution chamber, her last words would reveal something unexpected about the darkness that consumed an innocent child's life. Lisa Ann Coleman walked into that sterile execution room in Huntsville, Texas on September 17, 2014, knowing she would never walk out alive. At 38 years old, she had spent 8 years on death row for one of the most disturbing child abuse cases Texas had ever seen. The victim was Davontae Marcel Williams, just 9 years old when his emaciated body was discovered weighing only 35 pounds, covered in over 250 distinct injuries, and bearing the unmistakable signs of prolonged torture and starvation. Before we dive deeper into this shocking case that will challenge everything you think you know about justice and evil, make sure to subscribe to Criminal Mind Cortex and hit that notification bell. We bring you the most compelling true crime cases from around the world, and trust me, you will not want to miss what comes next in this devastating account. But this case was far more complex than it initially appeared. Coleman was not Davontae's mother, nor was she a stranger who had kidnapped him. She was the romantic partner of his mother, Marcella Williams, and their toxic relationship had created a house of horrors where a vulnerable child became the target of unimaginable cruelty. What made this case even more tragic was that Child Protective Services had been involved with this family for years, yet somehow failed to prevent the ultimate tragedy that would shock even seasoned investigators. As Coleman prepared to face lethal injection, she would become only the 15th woman executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, and the 6th woman to die in Texas since 1982. Her final words would echo through the execution chamber, leaving witnesses to wonder about the true nature of justice and whether her death could somehow balance the scales for the innocent life that was lost. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must first understand the people involved and the circumstances that brought them together in Arlington, Texas. Lisa Ann Coleman was born on October 6, 1975, in Tarrant County. She grew up in a troubled environment and had already accumulated a criminal record by the time she met Marcella Williams. Coleman had previously served time for possession with intent to deliver controlled substances and burglary of a habitation, showing a pattern of criminal behavior that would escalate dramatically. Marcella Williams was a young mother who had given birth to Davontae when she was just 14 years old. Davontae Marcel Williams was born 4 months premature, which initially caused developmental challenges, but medical experts would later testify that despite his premature birth, he had shown normal growth patterns in his early years. His developmental disabilities made him particularly vulnerable, requiring extra care and patience that he would tragically never receive. Davontae also had a younger sister named Destiny, who would later become a crucial witness in the case against Coleman. The family lived in a modest apartment complex in Arlington, where neighbors would occasionally see the children playing outside, though Davontae's appearances became increasingly rare as the abuse intensified. Coleman and Marcella Williams had been in a romantic relationship for several years, and Coleman spent considerable time living in the apartment with Williams and her children. Their relationship was volatile and marked by dysfunction, but it was Davontae who would bear the brunt of their combined anger and frustration. The dynamic between the two women created a dangerous environment where abuse was not only tolerated but actively participated in by both parties. The first major red flag came in 1999 when Child Protective Services removed Davontae and his sister from their mother's custody. The reason was clear and documented. Lisa Coleman was physically abusing Davontae. This should have been a wake-up call, a moment when the system could have intervened decisively to protect a vulnerable child. Instead, it became the first in a series of failures that would ultimately cost Davontae his life. CPS returned the children to Marcella Williams, but with one crucial condition: Davontae was not to be around Lisa Coleman. This restriction was put in place specifically to protect him from further abuse. However, this condition was completely ignored by Williams, who continued to allow Coleman to live with them and have unrestricted access to her son. Between 1995 and 2002, CPS investigated the family 7 different times for various allegations of abuse and neglect. Each investigation should have been an opportunity to save Davontae's life, but systemic failures and inadequate follow-up allowed the abuse to continue and escalate. In 2002, CPS lost track of the family entirely, leaving Davontae completely vulnerable to the escalating violence that would define the final years of his short life. What happened to Davontae Williams in the months and years leading up to his death represents one of the most systematic and prolonged cases of child torture documented in Texas legal history. The abuse was not impulsive or accidental. It was deliberate, sustained, and increasingly severe as time went on. Coleman and Williams developed a pattern of restraining Davontae using various methods. His 8-year-old sister Destiny would later testify that Coleman would tie up Davontae with an extension cord, binding his hands and feet to prevent him from moving freely. Coleman initially denied using an extension cord, but eventually admitted that she and Marcella had tied up Davontae on multiple occasions using clothesline and other restraints. The physical abuse was extensive and brutal. Coleman admitted to whipping Davontae with a belt, though she claimed to have stopped this practice by March 2004, just months before his death. She also admitted to causing a significant injury to his lip when she hit and pushed him, causing him to fall into a bar stool. The injury left a permanent slit in his lip that was visible at the time of his death. Investigators found a golf club in the apartment that almost certainly had Davontae's blood on its head, and likely contained Coleman's DNA on the handle. When confronted with this evidence, Coleman denied any knowledge of how the golf club might have been used to harm the child, but the forensic evidence told a different tale. One of the most disturbing aspects of the abuse was the use of confinement as punishment. Coleman and Williams would lock Davontae in a pantry, a small enclosed space with a lock positioned several feet off the ground, making it impossible for the child to free himself. When investigators examined this pantry, they found what appeared to be a pool of urine inside, indicating that Davontae had been confined there for extended periods without access to bathroom facilities. The starvation was perhaps the most cruel aspect of the abuse. While other family members ate regular meals, Davontae was systematically deprived of adequate nutrition. His body began to shut down as malnutrition took hold, and his growth stopped entirely. Medical experts would later testify that his lack of proper nutrition made him stop growing, trapping him in the body of a much younger child while his chronological age continued to advance. As Davontae's condition deteriorated, Coleman and Williams made efforts to hide his condition from the outside world. According to CPS investigators, Coleman stated that Marcella did not want to take Davontae to a doctor because she was afraid that once medical professionals saw the bruises and marks on his body, CPS would be called and her children would be taken away. This fear of discovery led them to keep Davontae increasingly isolated from anyone who might report his condition. When people would ask about Davontae's whereabouts, Marcella would tell them that he was staying with relatives, even though he was actually confined in the apartment. This deception allowed the abuse to continue without outside interference, creating a prison-like environment where a 9-year-old child was slowly being tortured to death. The isolation was so complete that neighbors in the apartment complex rarely saw Davontae in the final months of his life. 4 witnesses who lived in the same complex would later submit affidavits stating that they had seen Davontae around the neighborhood unrestrained and in good spirits just days before his death, but these sightings were rare exceptions to his usual confinement. The morning of July 26, 2004 began like any other in the Arlington apartment complex, but it would end with the discovery of one of the most horrific child abuse cases in Texas history. Emergency services received a call reporting that a child was having difficulty breathing, a call that would lead paramedics to a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Paramedic Troy Brooks arrived at the residence within minutes of receiving the call, but what he found defied his years of emergency medical experience. Davontae Williams was obviously dead, and Brooks could tell that the child had been deceased for several hours before the emergency call was made. The delay in calling for help suggested that Coleman and Williams had tried to figure out how to handle the situation before finally contacting authorities. Davontae was found wearing nothing but bandages and a diaper, his tiny body so emaciated and underweight that it was shocking even to experienced first responders. Brooks and another paramedic initially estimated that the 9-year-old child weighed only 25 pounds, though the official autopsy would later determine his weight to be 35 pounds, still roughly half the normal weight for a child his age. Crime scene investigator Regina Taylor documented the extensive evidence of abuse throughout Davontae's body. She found numerous injuries covering his entire body, including a disfigured ear, severely swollen hands, the slit in his lip that Coleman had admitted to causing, and ligature marks around his wrists and ankles where he had been repeatedly restrained over an extended period. The medical examination revealed the true extent of the horror that Davontae had endured. Pediatrician Nancy Kellogg identified over 250 distinct wounds on his corpse, each one representing a separate incident of violence against the child. The injuries included burns from cigarettes or cigars, scars from various restraints, and evidence of repeated blunt force trauma. Dr. Conzelman, who performed the autopsy, initially believed that Davontae had died from life-threatening blunt force injuries, possibly including bleeding on the brain or broken bones. However, his detailed examination revealed that the actual cause of death was malnutrition, with pneumonia as a contributing factor. The pneumonia itself was a direct result of his severely weakened immune system caused by prolonged starvation. The pathologist's findings were particularly significant because they demonstrated that despite his premature birth, Davontae had previously shown normal growth patterns. Dr. Kellogg explained that a metabolic disease was not responsible for his malnutrition. This was clearly the result of deliberate starvation over an extended period. Evidence at the scene showed that some attempt had been made to treat Davontae in his final days. He had been given Theraflu, Alka-Seltzer, and NyQuil, and various ointments, creams, and bandages had been applied to his wounds. There was also evidence that he had consumed chicken noodle soup, Pediasure, and Pedialyte prior to his death. However, Dr. Conzelman testified that these efforts were inadequate, too late, and possibly even harmful to a severely malnourished child. More importantly, he observed that the attempt to treat Davontae at home was likely motivated by a desire to prevent him from coming to the attention of medical professionals who would have been required to report his condition to authorities. The investigation revealed that both Coleman and Williams were present in the apartment when Davontae died, and both were immediately taken into custody. The evidence against them was overwhelming, from the physical condition of Davontae's body to the statements they made to investigators about their treatment of the child. The legal proceedings that followed Davontae's death would span several years and involve complex questions about the nature of capital murder under Texas law. On September 22, 2004, a Tarrant County grand jury indicted Lisa Coleman for murdering Davontae Williams in the course of committing kidnapping, a charge that made her eligible for the death penalty. The prosecution's case was built around the extensive physical evidence of abuse and the testimony of witnesses who had observed the systematic mistreatment of Davontae. Prosecutor Dixie Bassano would later state that there was not an inch on Davontae's body that had not been bruised, scarred, or injured, emphasizing the comprehensive nature of the abuse he had suffered. One of the most crucial witnesses was Davontae's 8-year-old sister Destinée, who testified about seeing Coleman tie up her brother with extension cords and other restraints. Her testimony provided first-hand evidence of the abuse and helped establish the pattern of systematic mistreatment that had led to Davontae's death. The defense strategy focused primarily on challenging the kidnapping charge that made Coleman eligible for the death penalty. Under Texas law, capital murder requires an underlying felony, and prosecutors had used kidnapping as that underlying crime. Coleman's attorney, John Stickles, argued that while his client's actions constituted child abuse, they did not meet the legal definition of kidnapping under Texas law. The relevant sections of the Texas Penal Code define kidnapping as intentionally or knowingly abducting another person, with abduction meaning to restrain a person with intent to prevent their liberation by secreting or holding them in a place where they are not likely to be found, or by using or threatening to use deadly force. Stickles contended that restraining a child as punishment, even inappropriately, did not constitute kidnapping in the legal sense. He argued that the restraints used on Davontae were misguided attempts at discipline rather than kidnapping, and that the prosecution had stretched the definition of the crime to make Coleman eligible for the death penalty. However, the trial court and subsequent appeals courts ruled that Coleman's actions did constitute kidnapping under Texas law. The systematic restraint of Davontae, combined with efforts to hide his presence from visitors and prevent him from leaving the apartment, met the legal requirements for the kidnapping charge. On June 19, 2006, after hearing all the evidence, a Tarrant County jury convicted Lisa Coleman of capital murder. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before reaching their verdict, suggesting that they found the evidence against Coleman to be overwhelming and convincing. 2 days later, on June 21, 2006, the same jury sentenced Coleman to death after a separate punishment proceeding. The decision to impose the death penalty reflected the jury's conclusion that Coleman's crimes were among the most serious and heinous that could be committed. Meanwhile, Marcella Williams, Davontae's mother and Coleman's co-defendant, chose a different path. Instead of going to trial, Williams accepted prosecutors' offer to plead guilty in exchange for a life sentence. She remains in custody and will not be eligible for parole until 2044. Coleman's conviction and sentence were affirmed by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals on December 9, 2009, on direct appeal. She then appealed to the United States Supreme Court, which denied her petition for a writ of certiorari on October 4, 2010. Lisa Coleman spent 8 years on death row, during which time her attorneys filed multiple appeals, challenging both her conviction and her death sentence. Her legal team continued to argue that the kidnapping charge was inappropriate and that she should not have been eligible for the death penalty. On August 25, 2010, Coleman filed an application for habeas corpus relief, which was denied by the Court of Criminal Appeals. She then filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus in federal court, but this was also denied on January 20, 2012. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected Coleman's appeal on May 23, 2013, affirming the district court's denial of habeas corpus relief. Her final appeal to the United States Supreme Court was denied on February 14, 2014, exhausting all of her legal options. On April 24, 2014, the 297th State District Court issued an order setting Coleman's execution date for September 17, 2014. This gave her attorneys several months to file any final appeals or clemency petitions. Coleman's appellate attorney John Stickles filed a clemency application in August asking Texas Governor Rick Perry to commute her sentence to life in prison. However, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted unanimously not to recommend commutation, effectively ending any hope of avoiding execution. In a controversial statement, Stickles argued that Coleman's race and sexual orientation had played a role in her receiving the death penalty. He stated that what she was really guilty of was being a black lesbian, and that her sexual orientation had influenced both the state's decision to seek the death penalty and the jury's decision to impose it. On her final day, Coleman was transferred to the Huntsville unit, where Texas conducts all of its executions. She was given the opportunity to meet with family members and spiritual advisors, and to make phone calls to say goodbye to loved ones. 5 family members and friends came to witness her execution, though notably, no one appeared to represent Davontae Williams. Texas had discontinued the practice of offering special last meals to condemned inmates, so Coleman was served the same meal provided to all inmates in the unit that day: a fried pork chop, macaroni and cheese, carrots, green beans, navy beans, sliced bread, and pineapple orange cake, with a choice of tea, punch, or water to drink. As the time for execution approached, Coleman was strapped to a gurney and wheeled into the execution chamber. Witnesses reported that she appeared calm and at peace with her fate. She had told jailers earlier that day that she was ready and knew where she was going, and that she was not bitter about her situation. When given the opportunity to make a final statement, Coleman looked toward her supporters and smiled. Her last words were directed at her fellow death row inmate, Darlie Rotier, and to her family and friends who had come to witness her execution. "I am all right," she said. "Tell them I finished strong. God is good." She then smiled and blew kisses at her supporters before adding, "God bless you all." At 6:12 in the evening on September 17, 2014, officials began administering a lethal dose of pentobarbital. Coleman was pronounced dead at 6:24, just 12 minutes after the injection began. Witnesses reported that the execution was peaceful, with only a short gasp heard before she passed away. Lisa Coleman became the 517th person executed in Texas since the state reinstated the death penalty in 1982, and the 9th person executed in the state in 2014. Nationally, she was only the 15th woman executed since the Supreme Court allowed states to resume capital punishment in 1976, highlighting how rarely women receive the ultimate punishment. The case of Davontae Williams exposed serious flaws in the child protection system that was supposed to keep vulnerable children safe. Despite 7 separate CPS investigations between 1995 and 2002, and despite a specific court order that Davontae should not be around Lisa Coleman, the system failed to protect him when he needed it most. In 2004, Davontae's case became part of a state review of 1,103 child abuse cases in North Texas that was ordered by Governor Rick Perry. The Health and Human Services Commission Office of Inspector General found that CPS caseworkers failed 70% of the time to act quickly to protect children in danger. The Inspector General's report concluded that CPS Region 3, which covered the Dallas and Fort Worth area, was performing at minimum standards and often below standards. When abuse or neglect was indicated in case files, only 30% of the time did CPS caseworkers implement appropriate safety steps for the short-term protection of the child. These systemic failures meant that Davontae Williams fell through the cracks of a system that was supposed to protect him. Multiple opportunities to intervene and save his life were missed, and the consequences were tragic and irreversible. The case also raised questions about the application of capital punishment in cases involving domestic violence and child abuse. Coleman's attorneys argued that her race and sexual orientation had influenced the decision to seek the death penalty, though prosecutors maintained that the severity of the crime justified the ultimate punishment. Marcella Williams, Davontae's mother, continues to serve her life sentence and will not be eligible for parole until 2044. Her decision to accept a plea bargain rather than face trial likely saved her from the death penalty, but it also meant that she avoided the full scrutiny of a public trial. The memory of Davontae Williams serves as a reminder of the vulnerability of children who depend on adults for their safety and well-being. His short life was marked by suffering that no child should ever endure, and his death represents a failure of multiple systems that were supposed to protect him. For those who worked on the case, from the paramedics who discovered his body to the prosecutors who sought justice for his death, Davontae's case remains one of the most disturbing they have ever encountered. The image of a 9-year-old child weighing only 35 pounds, covered in hundreds of injuries, is not easily forgotten. The execution of Lisa Coleman brought a form of legal closure to the case, but it cannot undo the suffering that Davontae endured or bring him back to life. What it can do is serve as a reminder that society has a responsibility to protect its most vulnerable members, and that when we fail in that responsibility, the consequences can be devastating and irreversible. If you found this case as devastating and thought-provoking as we did, make sure to subscribe to Criminal Mind Cortex for more incredible true crime investigations that expose the darkest corners of human nature, while honoring the memory of victims who deserve to have their stories told. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest deep dives into the most compelling cases from around the world.